I thought my mountain mansion would be my forever sanctuary until the HOA arrived with claims I never imagined, and a storm began that would change everything. High in the mountains, where the trees grew thick and the air carried the scent of pine, I built the kind of home I had always dreamed of. It was not just a house. It was a retreat, a vision of peace standing proudly against the rolling horizon. My mansion overlooked valleys blanketed in mist each morning, and in the evenings the skies turned into a canvas of colors that no city could ever offer. The land itself had called to me. Years earlier, I had walked through these very woods as a traveler, and I remembered stopping at the ridge where the sun dipped low. I whispered to myself that one day, if fortune favored me, I would claim this view as my own. That promise stayed alive in my heart, and when the opportunity finally came, I seized it without hesitation. The design of the mansion was a story of harmony. I worked with architects who understood my vision: stone walls drawn from the mountain itself, wooden beams that echoed the tall pines, and wide glass windows that opened the indoors to the vastness outside. Each room had a purpose. A library filled with shelves stretching to the ceiling, a music hall where the sound of a piano could drift into the night air, and balconies where I could sip tea while listening to the rustle of leaves. Neighbors often wondered why I chose solitude over the crowded comfort of city life. To me, the answer was simple. The mountain gave me something the city never could. Here, I was free from constant noise, from honking horns and flashing lights. Instead, I woke to birdsong and the golden light spilling through my windows. The silence was not empty. It was full, carrying the whispers of wind and the soft trickle of streams. Building the mansion had not been easy. Roads had to be carved carefully, respecting the terrain. Supplies came in slowly, each beam and stone placed with care. Yet, I never grew impatient. Each stage of progress was a reminder that I was shaping a dream, one brick at a time. By the time the last roof tile was placed, I stood back and realized that I had created not just a structure, but a symbol of my persistence. Visitors who came were often struck silent when they first saw the mansion. They would pause, eyes wide, as if unsure whether they were looking at something real. Some described it as a fortress of peace, others as a palace of solitude. To me, it was simply home. A place where the soul could rest, where ambitions could breathe, and where memories could grow. At night, when the stars scattered across the sky, I often sat by the great fireplace watching flames dance. The walls would glow, shadows would play, and I would think of how far I had come from that traveler who once stood at the ridge. My mountain mansion was more than wood, stone, and glass. It was the fulfillment of a promise I had made to myself long ago. For a time, life in the mansion felt untouchable. Each day carried its own rhythm. Morning light spilling across the windows, afternoons filled with quiet work, and evenings of rest under the stars. Yet even in paradise, shadows sometimes gather where they are least expected. Mine came in the form of a letter slipped into my mailbox one crisp autumn morning. The letter bore the seal of the local Homeowners Association, a group I had barely interacted with since moving into the area. At first, I thought it was a welcome note or some notice about road maintenance. Instead, the words inside startled me. They claimed I owed several months of unpaid community fees with interest already added. The total was far larger than anything reasonable. I read the letter twice, then a third time, convinced I must have misunderstood. I had always been careful with my finances. Every legitimate bill had been paid on time. The HOA demand was not only unexpected, it was impossible. Yet the tone of the message was sharp, leaving little room for discussion. It warned of serious consequences should I fail to comply. I set the letter aside, determined to clarify the matter. Surely it was a clerical error, some mix-up in their records. The following week, I sent a polite response, requesting an itemized explanation of the supposed charges. Days passed without an answer. Then another letter arrived, this one written more firmly, repeating the same claim and even increasing the amount. Confusion gave way to unease. I began to notice how other residents avoided speaking too openly about the HOA. Some hinted that the group often pushed boundaries, enforcing rules and collecting fees in ways that felt more like demands than community service. I wondered if I had been targeted simply because my mansion stood out larger and more visible than the surrounding homes. As the letters continued, the language grew colder, less neighborly. What began as a request soon felt like an accusation, as though I had committed some unspoken offense. I walked through the halls of my mansion, the place I had built with such care, and a thought kept circling in my mind. How could an organization I hardly knew hold such sway over my peace? The mountain had given me freedom, but now an unexpected weight pressed against that freedom. The HOA words followed me, echoing even in the quietest corners of my home, and deep inside I sensed this was not a small misunderstanding. It was the beginning of a storm. Weeks slipped into months, and the matter with HOA refused to fade. What began as a single letter had grown into a steady stream of notices. Each envelope carried a new figure, larger than the last, along with stern reminders that I had not fulfilled my obligations. Their persistence felt less like a conversation and more like a campaign, as though they hoped I would surrender simply to end the pressure. I tried reason first. I visited the HOA office, a modest building at the edge of town. Inside, the atmosphere was oddly formal. A clerk received me politely, but when I asked for a breakdown of the supposed fees, she shuffled papers and gave vague explanations. Administrative charges, community improvements, and maintenance reserves. Phrases without substance. When I pressed for receipts or records, she smiled thinly and promised to look into it. Days later, I received yet another letter, nearly identical to the last. The tone of the community began to shift as well. Neighbors who once waved kindly at me now seemed hesitant, their greetings shortened, their eyes cautious. I sensed whispers spreading, stories planted by the HOA about my supposed refusal to pay. It stung to think that people I had considered friendly might now view me as careless or dishonest. The notices soon grew more dramatic. They no longer spoke only of unpaid fees, but hinted at enforcement measures. The words were vague yet heavy, carrying a quiet threat beneath their politeness. For the first time since building my mansion, I began to feel uneasy in my own home. I would sit on the balcony at dusk, watching the sky fade into twilight, and wonder what kind of authority the HOA truly held. Then came the most unsettling moment. I returned one afternoon to find a small group of men in reflective vests standing near the road leading to my property. They weren't working. They were simply observing, clipboards in hand, pointing toward the house as though measuring its worth. When I approached, they offered no explanation. One of them simply nodded and said, "Routine survey," before leaving. That evening, I walked through the grand halls of my mansion and realized that the silence no longer felt comforting. It was heavy, as if the mountain itself was waiting for something to unfold. What had started as a financial dispute was now pressing against the very walls of the home I had built with such care. And though no harm had yet come, the air carried a sense of tension that could not be ignored. The day I returned to find the road blocked, I knew the matter had crossed a threshold. A police vehicle was stationed at the entrance to my property, its lights silent, but its presence unmistakable. The officer explained politely that he had been asked to monitor the situation due to an ongoing dispute with the HOA. Though his words were neutral, the implication was clear. My home was no longer just my sanctuary, it had become a subject of scrutiny. Inside the mansion, I unfolded the latest notice, this one printed in bold letters, announcing that the HOA had taken administrative action. They claimed to have the right to enforce compliance even without my agreement. For the first time, the paper spoke not of requests, but of decisions already made. The weight of their authority pressed against me like the mountain fog that rolls in silently, covering everything it touches. News traveled quickly. Local papers carried short columns about the non-compliant homeowner, carefully worded yet unmistakably directed at me. Acquaintances called, some offering sympathy, others asking cautious questions. I could hear curiosity in their voices, a mixture of concern and fascination. The mansion that had once been admired for its beauty was now discussed as a point of conflict. I felt frustration rising, yet I resisted letting it turn to bitterness. Instead, I documented everything: letters, dates, conversations, and even the unexplained visits from surveyors. Each entry was a small act of defense, a way to preserve truth in a storm of claims. In quiet moments, I would sit in my library, surrounded by shelves of books, and remind myself that records and facts had their own power. But even with my efforts, the atmosphere had changed. Where once the mountain air had carried only peace, it now seemed charged with unease. At night, the distant sound of machinery echoed faintly from the valley below. It might have been ordinary construction, yet in my mind it carried another meaning. I could not shake the thought that preparations were being made, unseen but deliberate. The fallout was not loud or sudden. It was slow, like a steady drip of water wearing down stone. My mansion still stood tall against the mountainside, yet I knew the conflict with HOA seeped into its very foundation. I had entered a new stage of the struggle, one where the fight was no longer about fees alone, but about the right to call this mountain my home, my home. When pressure grows too heavy, one must choose between surrender and resolve. I chose resolve. The mansion, the land, and the life I had built upon this mountain were not the result of carelessness. They were the fruit of years of effort and dreams fulfilled. I refused to let unclear fees and vague threats determine my future. I began with patience and precision. Every letter I had received, every visit I had witnessed, and every conversation I had endured became part of a carefully organized record. Stacks of folders soon lined my study, each labeled and cross-referenced. Where the hay spoken in generalities, I answered with clarity. Where they used broad statements, I collected details. In the quiet of the library, surrounded by papers and notes, I built not only a defense but also a mirror to show the truth of their actions. With these records in hand, I sought guidance. Legal experts, financial advisors, and even state officials were willing to listen once they saw the extent of the HOA claims. Many raised eyebrows, some shook their heads. Words like overreach and a mismanagement surfaced in their remarks. What had felt for months like a solitary battle began to appear as something larger, a pattern that stretched beyond my single home. At the same time, I reached out to neighbors. Quiet conversations over fences and pathways revealed stories not unlike mine. Others, too, had faced puzzling charges, sudden increases, or unexplained fines. Many had paid simply to avoid trouble. A few admitted they had wished to resist but lacked the time, the energy, or the resources. My persistence inspired them, and slowly a circle of support began to form. The HOA had expected silence and compliance, but instead it had stirred awareness. I shared my records openly, allowing both neighbors and officials to see for themselves. The weight of evidence began to shift the balance. Whispers that once painted me as a non-compliant now turned into questions about the HOA authority. This was not revenge in the common sense of the word. It was not fueled by anger but by determination, not driven by destruction but by light. I wanted truth to be seen, fairness to be restored, and a reminder placed firmly on the record. Communities are meant to serve their residents, not the other way around. As the weeks passed, I no longer felt isolated on my mountain. I felt the ground firming beneath me, as though the very stones of my home were lending strength. The turning point had arrived. The HOA had not weakened me. It had awakened me. The storm that once hung over my mansion eventually broke, not with thunder, but with quiet clarity. My records, my patience, and the support of others had woven together into something undeniable. What began as a single homeowner standing against confusing demands had grown into a wider examination of how the HOA had operated for years. Officials reviewed the evidence carefully. Meetings were held, reports drafted, and slowly a picture emerged, one that showed not negligence on my part, but overreach on theirs. The weight of their own actions began to tip the scale. The very authority they had claimed so boldly now slipped from their grasp piece by piece as oversight replaced their unchecked control. For the first time in many months, I walked the halls of my mansion without the shadow of worry trailing me. The notices stopped arriving. The surveyor stopped appearing on the road. The officer's vehicle no longer sat at the entrance. Silence returned to the mountain, not heavy this time, but pure, like the silence after a long rain, when the earth breathes deeply again. The greatest change, however, was not only in the letters or the laws. It was in the community itself. Neighbors who once kept their distance began to knock on my door, offering kind words and even apologies. We shared conversations not about fear of fees, but about gardens, families, and the joy of living in such a remarkable place. Bonds, once thinned by suspicion, grew strong again. As for me, I learned that strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is steady, patient, and quiet like the mountain itself. I had not sought conflict, but when it arrived, I had met it with truth rather than retreat. And in doing so, I had discovered not only resilience in myself, but unity in others. On clear mornings now, I step out onto the balcony and let my gaze travel across the valley. The mansion still stands firm and bright against the forested slopes, yet it feels different, not because the walls or windows have changed, but because I know its story has deepened. The HOA district that once seemed unshakable is no longer on the map. In its place stands a renewed sense of fairness and freedom. And as the sun rises higher, casting its light over the ridge, I whisper a quiet promise that this mountain, this home, and this peace will remain guarded not by fear, but truth.